Friends, I mentioned in the last video that no matter how we might be tempted to, we can never infer backwards from how well or badly someone's life is going to that person's true status and standing before God. We see this in an especially poignant way in chapter 1, verse 8. And I say that this is poignant because Job actually never learns that this is true. We know about chapters 1 and 2, but Job never learns what happens here. We read in chapter 1, verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in all the earth, a man blameless and upright, who fears God and turns from evil?" In case you can't tell, that is an absolutely sterling recommendation. First of all, calling Job my servant, that puts him, the people described as my servant in the Old Testament are like Abraham, David, Moses. That is top tier sainthood in the Old Testament. Not only that, you'll notice that verse 8 sounds a lot like verse 1 in the same chapter, but God adds the phrase, "There is none like him in all the earth." If you look for that phrase elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's most often used for God himself in the worship of him, that there's no other God like him in the whole world. And God uses that phrase for Job. It's used for human beings every once in a while. Solomon and Hezekiah are described that way. But most often, it's used for God. And God describes Job that way. That is amazing. All the human characters in the book of Job are convinced, just convinced, that God must be so furious and disappointed and angry with Job. The friends, that God has good reason for being angry. Job, that God has no good reason for being angry. He's just an irrational tyrant. And the book of Job tells us right up front, the opposite is true. God is beaming with pride he is so enthusiastic over Job. And Job never learns it. From the answer that God gives, Job can infer that God is not angry with him, he is not suffering for some hidden sin. But God never says this to him directly, and I think actually we understand why. If God, after Job has suffered so much, if God were to appear and say, "Job, I love you so much," it would sound too much like a father trying to pacify a child throwing a temper tantrum, you know? Job never learns this. Here's the point. In the book of Job, God allows Job to fall into a position where Job has every empirical evidence that God is so furious with him, so disappointed and angry and trying to destroy him. But the exact opposite is the case. In the genius of the book of Job, the way it engages with us, we know more about Job's situation than Job ever does. And the implication for us is that sometimes God will allow us to fall into a situation where we have every evidence God has given up on us. But the faith that justifies dares and even insists that in Christ God is utterly pleased, happy, and satisfied with you. It dares to say that, contradicting every empirical evidence, and to insist on it. And friends, that will never change because God never changes. It's more likely that Jesus could go back in the tomb or back on the cross than God could fail to be anything other than utterly happy and pleased with you in Christ. In fact, friends, in Job chapter 1, God is so proud of Job, he's bragging about him to the devil. And friends, in Christ, he feels the same way about you.